a torn scream in the corridor, a smear of blood along the staircase rail, the dull thud of flesh falling where flesh should not fall. They said he slipped, that it was the stairs, that he shouldn't have been walking alone. But no one quite explained why he was already bleeding before he reached the ground, or why, in the hours before his death, he babbled the king's name over and over again like a spell he hoped might save him. After his death, the kitchen boys found a length of intestine knotted in the reeds beneath the privy stairs. Some whispered it was his. Others whispered worse. This was the fate of the man once called the son of Whitehall, the jester, the confidant, the beloved fool, the one the king held closer than his own sons. Today we reveal the real story behind the rise and mutilation of James Upton, court favorite, whispered lover, and the most violently unmade man in Tudor England. He was born in 1502, or thereabouts. No parish kept him in their records. His mother was said to be a laundress who died giving birth beneath a frost-laced hedge outside Coventry. His father, if there was one, is never named. He arrived at court not by blood, but by mimicry. First noticed at 12 years old for his uncanny ability to imitate the way Cardinal Wolsey's jowls shook when he shouted. By 13, he was a stable boy who could make a duchess weep from laughter by impersonating her gout-stricken husband. By 15, he was in the kitchens, singing scandalous verses about Anne Boleyn's French education. By 17, he was dining beside the king. There is no other record in the period of a common-born boy being so swiftly adopted into the heart of royal favor without military valor, political use, or beauty. Upton had none of those. What he had was timing. He arrived at the exact moment King Henry VIII, bloated with disappointment over his lack of a male heir and suffocating beneath layers of statecraft, was hungering for distraction. Upton delivered. He invented dances that mocked rival courts. He wrote verses mocking the Pope and set them to Flemish melodies that lingered for days in the king's mind. Once, he even staged a parody of Henry's own coronation, casting himself as both the king and the bishop, switching wigs mid-performance, while the real monarch howled with delight. It was the only time anyone was ever allowed to touch the king's crown without punishment. But court attention is a venom-laced cup, and Upton drank deep. At 23, he lived in a suite of rooms that had once belonged to a nobleman executed for treason. He wore silks imported from Florence. He was permitted to sit in the king's presence, something that made more than one noble grind his teeth to nubs. When foreign ambassadors visited, it was James Upton who stood at the king's side translating bawdy Italian proverbs and offering sweetmeats. There is a letter kept in the Ashmolean archives from the ambassador of Aragon, describing him as a boy who walks like a prince and speaks like a devil. Yet for all his elevation, Upton's body was already betraying him. He was not a handsome man. Eyewitnesses described a crooked smile and a neck like a goose's, with one shoulder visibly higher than the other. His teeth were stained, his skin perpetually damp. And by 1530, court physicians had already begun prescribing him mercury ointments for a rash they would not name, and which he never acknowledged. One theory suggests early syphilis. Another claims leprosy. But most scholars agree it was probably a mix of both and neither. By 1532, his fingernails began falling off. He wore gloves year-round. His once witty impersonations grew barbed. He joked once that the Queen's eyes smelled like vinegar, a comment that earned him 3 nights in the Tower. Then, inexplicably, a new fur-lined coat from the king himself. It was around this time that people began calling him the King's Mirror, a cruel nickname, because everyone knew mirrors showed the truth beneath the paint. He was the only man allowed to call Henry Hal, the only man who dared to tickle the king mid-prayer. And yet, in every portrait where the court painter included him, often in the background, often with a sly sideways glance, he is slightly hunched, as if ducking something. That something was power, and its appetite. There's a surviving list of palace expenses from 1530, for that includes an item so small it's almost missed. For the unguent used upon Master Upton's privy parts, 3 shillings. Historians still debate what this means. A euphemism? A joke? But soon after, Rumors began to surface that James Upton walked differently, that he winced when sitting, that, when pressed too hard during a jest, he once collapsed mid-laugh and urinated blood. And still he performed. Always he performed. One February evening, he entertained the court with a poem about sausages fit for queens that made the Dowager Countess spit her wine across the tapestries. An hour later, he fainted during the king's toast. He was carried out. That part is agreed upon. What happened next is not. Some say the queen insisted he be sent to a monastery to recover. Others insist the king wept openly beside his bedside. Still others claim Henry ordered a surgeon to open the boil near Upton's groin, only to find something festering, unnatural, and irreversible. Whatever the truth, after that winter, James Upton was changed. His voice dropped in pitch. He stopped dancing. And he never made another joke about castration again. At court, survival was measured not by loyalty, but by usefulness. And for nearly a decade, James Upton had been more useful than most. He was the lubricant that eased political friction, the laughter between excommunications, the jester who whispered treason in rhymed couplets and walked away with applause. But by 1535, his role had begun to sour. He had risen too high, too close, and too quickly. Favorites, unlike ministers, lacked armor. They had no estates to retreat to, no bloodline to shield them. Their protection was the king's mood, and Henry's moods, by now, had grown dangerous. His leg ulcer was worsening. His sleep was poor. His meals were heavy with wine and meat. The women at court whispered that he smelled like rotting apples. Even his own son, Edward, refused to sit near him at supper. Into this airless atmosphere, James Upton still waltzed, draped in fresh brocade and courtly smirks. But the courtiers who once laughed began to pause a beat longer before they joined in. One too many of Upton's jests ended with a glance toward a minister's bald spot or a nod to a noblewoman's barren womb. He still had the king's ear, but everyone else had knives. There was the infamous hawking accident. In front of the Duke of Norfolk, Upton unleashed a trained hawk that, instead of soaring, plummeted directly onto the Duke's horse, causing a scene that left 3 men concussed and 1 dog permanently lame. Upton apologized, bowed, and turned the incident into a limerick by sundown. But the Duke didn't forget. Then came the mask, a grotesque burlesque of the king's old marriage to Catherine of Aragon. In it, Upton played both bride and groom, alternating voices with cruel accuracy. Henry laughed at first, but the next day, the Privy Council convened in unusual silence. That same week, Upton was stripped of his official title, Gentleman of the Bedchamber, officially for indelicate behavior. Unofficially, everyone knew he'd crossed a line. He kept his rooms, but not his influence. The court shifted. Men who had once clamored to share his wine now passed his chamber without pause. Dinners grew quieter. The Queen and Bullen at that time reportedly banned him from her private parlor. A scribbled note in her lady-in-waiting's diary refers to him as the stinking cherub. No explanation. He tried to recover, wrote new verses, commissioned tapestries, gifted the king a monkey dressed as the Pope. But something had turned. Whispers began to spread that his humor had become black, that he spoke to no one in the garden, that once, while drunk, he kissed a statue of St. Peter and whispered, "He bleeds like me." And still his body weakened. He wore longer tunics now, always loose at the waist. He stopped mounting horses, claimed he'd been cursed by a French saddler. The truth was likely simpler. He could no longer bear the pressure against his groin. One stable boy reported seeing him remove his tunic late at night and drain a dark rag between his legs. Another claimed Upton flinched violently if touched at the hip. A maid who tended his sheets wrote only this: "It smelled like eggs, and not the good kind." Historians have debated for years what afflicted him. A few blame tertiary syphilis. One more sensational theory posits self-mutilation. Another suggests a royal punishment, administered in secret, to cool his humors. But there is one letter, fragile and half-burnt, in the archives of Eton College. It is unsigned, but the handwriting matches that of Thomas Cromwell. It reads, "The king's creature festers. His seat is unclean. Yet still his majesty clings to the worm like a wet rag. If he will not dismiss him, we must see him made into something less than a man." The phrasing is deliberate. The intent, impossible to ignore. The Privy Council, already terrified of Upton's closeness to the king, had reason to fear more. There were rumors, dangerous, treasonous ones, that the king had wept in Upton's arms, that he had kissed the man's forehead during a fit of fever, that in one dark moment he had told Upton his heir would never rule, because "you're the only one who understands me." Whether true or not, in Tudor England, affection between men of unequal rank, especially royal men, could curdle into scandal faster than unmilked cream. And so the pressure built. Cromwell watched. Norfolk waited. And Upton continued to perform, slower now, pale, his wit edged with desperation. In early spring 1537, the Queen miscarried again. The court was thick with tension. Henry was inconsolable. Upton, in an act of either genius or madness, stood before the court and recited a poem in Latin mocking the Pope's fertility rites. The punchline included a goat, 3 friars, and a very detailed anatomical pun. The king did not laugh. Later that night, Upton's rooms were searched. Officially, they found nothing. Unofficially, it was said they found letters. Letters written in Upton's own hand, comparing Henry to the Roman Emperor Caligula, and describing the Queen as a slab of flesh dressed in pearls. He wasn't arrested, but the next day, his bed was moved to the furthest wing of the palace. He remained there, half-exiled, for the next 2 months. This was the most dangerous phase for a favorite, not yet discarded, but no longer protected. The court circled like wolves. He was vulnerable, and everyone knew it. Still, Upton did not flee. Perhaps he believed the king would forgive him again. Perhaps he had nowhere else to go. Or perhaps, as some later claimed, he had already begun to go mad. He wandered the corridors barefoot. He whispered to paintings. He scribbled lines of poetry in charcoal on the walls of the garderobe. The palace laundresses refused to clean his linens, claiming they spoke when touched. There is no official record of how many enemies plotted his fall. But there is ample suggestion that when the moment came, when the true punishment was finally inflicted, it was done not in the king's name, but in his absence. In the late hours of April 19, 1537, 3 palace guards reported hearing a sound they later described as not quite human. A sort of keening, a sharp, breathless moan, followed by a rhythmic thudding. One guard claimed it was a fox caught in the pantry. Another said it sounded more like choking. None of them investigated. By morning, James Upton was gone. Gone not in the poetic sense, not merely from favor, but physically absent. His rooms were found empty. His slippers still warm near the hearth. One candlestick had been overturned. And on the linen sheet of his bed, a single dark stain the size of a child's palm, already turning brown. No message. No witnesses. No alarm. He reappeared 3 days later. They found him at dawn, collapsed behind the chapel wall, curled between 2 stone urns of rosemary that had not flowered in years. He was naked except for a chemise clutched around his waist like a child with a stolen blanket. His legs were caked with blood and something darker. He did not speak. He did not move. They carried him inside, wrapped in a rug meant for guests' estate. He did not walk again for 6 weeks. The physicians summoned refused to write a diagnosis. One claimed it was a rupture of the groin. Another, less delicately, muttered something about punishment by incision. There is no consensus among scholars even today. But what is agreed upon is this. James Upton had been forcibly castrated. Whether by surgical means, violence, or rot, no one could say. He was missing more than just flesh. His breath was shallow. His eyes unfocused. The man who once composed sharp verses now muttered in half-formed couplets, most of them about rain. One observer wrote, "He smells of iron and milk. There is a hissing from him, as if his soul leaks out." The court was told he had been sent to recover from a fall. But a silent fear spread, especially among those who had once counted themselves favorites. If he could be touched, disfigured, unmade, what protection did they have? Henry did not speak of it. He neither punished nor defended. He simply did not visit. And in that silence, the real rotting began. The flesh around Upton's groin blackened. His belly swelled, full of trapped gases and septic fluid. He refused food. He clawed at his sheets. His skin turned the color of wax, dipped in bile. A lady-in-waiting who sat with him briefly described the smell as thick enough to eat. One morning, a physician attempted to lance the swelling. What emerged, according to the apothecary's notes, was a stew of blood, green phlegm, and something that might once have been fat. There is debate among historians about whether the castration had been botched or intentional. One school suggests that Upton may have been chemically sterilized using a mixture of burnt lime and vinegar applied forcibly. Others claim sharp instruments were used, perhaps shears, perhaps heated tongs. Theories abound, but no record remains of the act itself. No one ever confessed, and Upton never said a word about it. His voice, once his greatest weapon, had withered into whispers. When he did speak, he often asked for candles. To keep the dark out, he'd say. It knows I'm hollow. During this period, his chamber had to be fumigated twice weekly. A mixture of vinegar, rosemary, and crushed juniper was burned in brass pots just to keep the air breathable. Even the rats avoided his room. He began to deteriorate in strange ways. His toenails turned upward. His eyes crusted shut each morning. His breath was sweet, sickly, the scent of acetone, which modern scholars attribute to ketone buildup in starvation. Some believe he may have developed diabetes or suffered organ failure. Others say it was simply grief. What made it worse was the mockery. He had once wielded words like blades. Now, those same courtiers sharpened theirs against him. A new court favorite emerged, young, golden-haired, sharp of jaw and tongue. He took to mimicking Upton's old routines, mocked his limp, staged a pantomime in which old Jimmy danced with phantom testicles in his pocket. The king reportedly chuckled. Upton remained behind the chapel walls, wrapped in silence and linen. But not everyone forgot. There is an odd entry in the Privy Purse accounts for 12 pounds of goose fat to the keeping of Master Hugh. Goose fat was commonly used for wound softening and skin lubrication. But 12 pounds suggests something more, perhaps an effort to keep his entire lower body from cracking open. He tried to return once. It was May 1537. A garden procession. The king in good humor. A gathering of musicians and jesters assembled to amuse him. And from behind a hedge, Upton appeared. He was thinner than any remembered, gaunt, gray-skinned, draped in a robe too long for his frame. He walked as if each step punctured him. But he stood tall and bowed low and said clearly, "It is said, 'Shall I make you laugh again, my lord?'" The silence that followed was not cold. It was choking. Henry looked at him briefly, then turned his eyes away. And in that motion, the flick of a royal wrist, the favorite's fate was sealed. Guards escorted him away, gently, but with finality. He was never seen in the king's presence again. Summer in Whitehall did not disguise decay, it intensified it. Heat thickened the air, and with it, the rot. The court was suffocating beneath layers of perfume, sweat, and anxiety. The Thames, running sluggish and low, carried the city's filth past the palace walls like a funeral procession of forgotten sins. And inside one forgotten chamber behind the chapel, James Upton waited to die. His room had been stripped of tapestries. The windows were shuttered. A single servant, an older woman who once scrubbed the Queen's feet, was assigned to him. She later described the task not as caretaking, but as one keeps a dying bird warm before the cat returns. Upton no longer spoke of laughter. He no longer spoke at all. What remained was more vessel than man, shriveled legs, a hunched spine, yellowing skin drawn tightly over bone. His fingernails curled inward. His gums receded. Patches of his scalp went bald in coin-shaped blisters. And yet the wound, the central wound, did not heal. It wept. It bled. It stank. Each morning the servant replaced soaked linens. She dabbed the raw flesh with vinegar and wine, per old physician's orders. But nothing stopped the infection. It was deeper than the body. It had rooted itself in the very space where manhood had once lived. There is a letter from the royal apothecary to Thomas Cromwell, dated August 7th, 1537. A single line. The patient appears to rot inward now. There were no visitors. Not officially. But late one night, as she tended the chamber candles, the servant swore she saw a figure at the door. A tall man, cloaked, with a limp that could have belonged to the king himself. He did not enter. He simply looked in, once, and turned away. Whether this was Henry or some shadow from Upton's past is unknown. But the sight sent the servant trembling. She spilled the tallow. The next morning she was reassigned to the kitchens. By mid-August, the smell had become unbearable. Palace staff complained. Guards refused the wing. Even dogs, usually unbothered by death, would not cross the threshold. Something more than illness was at work. According to a fringe account from a foreign ambassador's secretary, one night Upton was heard crying not in pain, but in laughter. Wild, cracking laughter that echoed down the gallery like a crow's shriek. When a guard dared peek through the keyhole, he saw Upton dancing. Or, trying to. He moved in stilted hops, bleeding feet smearing the floor. His robe was gone. His body looked bruised and green, like spoiled meat. And in his hands he clutched 2 boiled eggs. He held them beneath his chin and whispered, "Still mine. Still white." The next morning, the chamber floor was cleaned with lye. The decline accelerated. A carpenter was summoned to reinforce the bed frame. Upton had grown so light it creaked not from weight, but from the way his body seized in spasms. A physician tried laudanum. It made him hallucinate further. He whispered of men with iron mouths, of laughter that peeled skin, of a hollow womb inside him that kicked when no one watched. Some say this madness was guilt. Others say it was syphilis, finally devouring the mind. Still others, those who trafficked in the occult, spoke of divine punishment. That a man so intimate with kings, so loose with words, had tried to climb where angels fear to tread, and had been torn down for it. One of the more unusual records comes from the laundry mistress, who handled Upton's final sets of linen. In a letter later discovered in the roof beams of her cottage, she wrote, "The cloth speaks if you bend your ear. It says, I am not empty. He made me so. I am the hollow boy." 3 days before his death, the servant found him unresponsive. Not asleep, simply staring. At nothing. His pupils were fixed. His chest rose only slightly. And then he began to hum. A tune no one recognized. Melodic. Soft. Childlike. He kept humming through the night. Even when he soiled himself. Even when his bandages came loose and maggots were found near the wound. Even when a fly crawled across his eyeball and he did not blink. The humming continued. The final night, the storm broke. Thunder cracked over the palace like the sky had snapped its spine. Lightning lit the chamber every few seconds. At the last flash, the servant saw him turn his head toward the window and smile. The next morning, he was gone. Not missing, this time truly dead. His body was still warm, mouth open, eyes bloodshot. One hand at his chest, the other clenched around nothing. They dressed him in a monk's habit. The face was covered, the body sewn into coarse linen. No funeral was held. No bell tolled. He was carted out with the kitchen waste. No grave marker. No mention in the royal journal. Just a gap in the record. 3 weeks without entry. When writing resumed, it simply noted, "Airing of chamber behind chapel complete. Fit for future use." But not everyone forgot. Some whispered that his ghost lingered, smelling of cloves and blood. That a flicker of laughter echoed down the south gallery in rainstorms. That the smell returned each August, no matter how often the stone was scrubbed. One tale claimed that a court musician went mad after sleeping in the same chamber. That he began composing songs in rhymed couplets about a man with hollow hips who whispered in his sleep. But these are legends. What remains is only the body, or rather, what is not found of it. His death was not recorded in the king's ledger. His possessions were burned. And yet, beneath the chapel floor, in a hidden alcove once used by recusant priests, there lies a bundle, wrapped in stained linen, bound with gold thread. Inside it, 2 carved ivory spheres, each the size of a hen's egg, each inscribed with a word. Left, still. Right, mine. There was no inquest, no royal proclamation, no mourning garments, not a single black ribbon tied across the arm of a courtier. James Upton, once the voice that made kings laugh, once the confidant who whispered the softest flattery in the ear of England's most dangerous man, vanished from memory as efficiently as if he'd never drawn breath. But silence is rarely innocent. In the months following Upton's death, the court changed. Laughter became brittle. The jesters hesitated. The newer favorites never rose quite so high. Henry himself, fatter than ever and plagued by ulcers on both legs, had grown more paranoid. He dismissed 2 physicians, hanged one of his grooms, and banned mirrors from his chambers after reportedly catching his own reflection smiling back when he was not. Something haunted him, and it was not just his own looming death. One fragment survives from a page boy assigned to Henry's privy chamber. Scribbled in the margin of a psalter now housed in the British Library, it reads, "He mutters the name James in sleep." Not a curse, a wish. It's impossible to know whether the king felt guilt, grief, or merely irritation at the memory. But the traces remain barely perceptible, like the outline of a portrait painted over in haste. There is a curious record, however, buried in a merchant ledger from 1538, of an anonymous buyer purchasing a set of rare Syrian perfumes. Among them, myrrh, civet oil, and crushed violet resin. The note beside the order reads, "To mask the stink of absence." That phrase appears nowhere else in Tudor documentation. And yet, its poetic oddness, its aching specificity, feels unmistakably like the man who once wrapped cruelty in lyricism. Could it be that someone, somewhere, kept a trace of Upton alive? A lover? A rival? The king himself? Or perhaps, as some suspect, Upton authored his own erasure. The theory is marginal, held only by a handful of eccentric historians. It suggests that Upton engineered his own fall, orchestrated the whispers, and arranged for his disappearance, believing that only through obliteration could his art become eternal. That theory, of course, ignores the physical evidence, the wound, the rot, the smell, the blood. Still, poets are strange creatures. The last echo of Upton's name in the palace came not from a royal mouth, but from a cook. She had arrived in the kitchens years later and found her station haunted by a name scratched into the underside of the bread shelf. J.U. laughed last. No one knew who wrote it, but it was carved deeply. And yet, for all the stories, all the scraps and shadows, what remains most horrifying is not what was done to him, but how little it mattered. A man was castrated. Not as punishment, but as a gesture, a grotesque punctuation mark in the king's mood. And the world moved on. Historians still argue over the cause of Upton's final condition. Some blame tertiary syphilis. Others suspect tuberculosis of the lymphatic system. A more recent theory posits Fournier's gangrene, a rare and rapid infection of the groin that, if untreated, can devour tissue within hours. But none of these explanations account for the psychological collapse, the egg incident, the smell that clung to walls for months, the guards who refused to speak of what they'd seen. And then, of course, there is the matter of the ivory spheres, still housed, according to rumor, in a sealed reliquary beneath the crypt of St. Mary's Chapel in Windsor. No official record admits their existence. But a Vatican inventory from 1624 lists a double relic of uncertain origin, testicular, blasphemous, not to be displayed. So the story waits in half-light. It's not taught in schools, not cited in the great biographies of Henry VIII. It doesn't appear in portraits, plays, or pageants. But it lingers in odd notes, in suppressed archives, in the dead corners of palace blueprints. A man was unmade. Not killed, not disgraced, unmade, as if history itself took a knife and cut him free. Wind down 300 words. The corridors of power are never silent for long. New laughter replaces the old. New favorites rise, bringing new secrets to bury. The stench fades. The walls are scrubbed. The past is lacquered over like a spoiled panel of wood, smoothed, varnished, rendered presentable. And yet, if you know where to look, the cracks remain. In Whitehall's eastern wing, where sunlight struggles to enter past stained glass and centuries of soot, there are stones that no longer fit flush against the floor. Beneath one of them, they say, the scent still lingers faintly: rosemary, vinegar, and something darker. Time has no loyalty. It forgets even the most vibrant voices. But the body remembers. The palace remembers. And somewhere in the silence between thunder and footfall, between ritual and rot, James Upton still breathes. Not as man, not as memory, but as a caution, a whisper beneath the crown. The fate of the king's favorite was not an anomaly. It was not madness or fate or illness alone. It was a mechanism, a way for power to digest what no longer amused it. He made a king laugh until he didn't. And in that stillness, in that failure, he became disposable. He vanished. Not from history, but from comfort. And now, you know where he went.